The three peart subdivisions that Anika nilles had to completely relearn. If you ask most drummers what makes a Rush song difficult, they'll usually mention the odd time signatures, the lightning-fast fills, or the sheer endurance required to get through a full set. But according to Anika nilles, stepping into Neil Peart's role was challenging for a completely different reason. When Rush selected nilles as the drummer for their 50-something tour, she wasn't simply learning songs, she was learning an entire musical language. In recent interviews, nilles admitted that preparing Rush's catalog forced her to abandon many of her normal learning methods. She said she had to learn the music in a completely different way, because Neil Peart's drum parts weren't just rhythms, they were compositions inside the songs themselves. And nowhere was that challenge more obvious than in Subdivisions. For Rush fans, Subdivisions is one of the band's most beloved songs. Released in 1982 on the album Signals, it became an anthem for outsiders, dreamers, and anyone who felt like they didn't quite fit in. But for drummers, the song hides a secret. At first listen, it sounds deceptively simple. The synthesizers dominate the arrangement. The groove feels steady. Nothing seems overly flashy. Then you sit behind the drum kit and try to play it exactly the way Neil did. That's when the nightmare begins. Neil Peart approached Subdivisions differently from almost every rock drummer of his era. Instead of simply keeping time, he constantly shifted the internal pulse of the song. Tiny accents appeared in unexpected places. Ghost notes connected sections that most listeners never consciously hear. Fills weren't inserted for show. They acted as part of the melody itself. Anika nilles has spoken about how difficult it was to adapt to Neil's unique mindset and the way he thought about drumming. She explained that understanding his approach required her to think beyond technique and into his musical philosophy. That became especially important when she tackled the first subdivision hidden inside the song. The first subdivision that Anika nilles had to completely relearn wasn't a fill, it wasn't a solo, and it wasn't one of Neil Peart's famous technical showcases. It was the pulse underneath the main groove. That may sound surprising, but drummers know the hardest rhythms are often the ones that seem invisible. In Subdivisions, Neil created a groove that feels comfortable on the surface. Most casual listeners hear a steady beat supporting Geddy Lee's vocals and the song's powerful synthesizer lines. But underneath that familiar feel, Neil was constantly thinking in smaller rhythmic groupings. Instead of simply counting quarter notes, he built much of the groove around flowing 16th note subdivisions. Every hi-hat accent, every snare placement, and every ghost note was carefully positioned within that framework. The result is a groove that breathes. It pushes forward without rushing. It feels mechanical and human at the same time. That's far more difficult to perform than it sounds. Many drummers can play the notes, far fewer can reproduce the exact feel. For Anika nilles, this was a major adjustment because her own style has always been known for its creativity, modern phrasing, and fluid movement around the kit. She wasn't trying to imitate Neil mechanically. She needed to understand why every note existed. And that's where the challenge began. Several drummers who have analyzed Neil Peart's playing point out that his grooves often contain subtle dynamic changes that aren't obvious on paper. A transcription may show the notes, but it doesn't fully reveal the weight, touch, and placement that make the groove work. In other words, learning the chart isn't enough. You have to learn the mindset. Imagine spending hours practicing a section only to realize the notes are correct, but the feel is wrong. That was exactly the type of problem Anika faced while preparing Rush material. The more she studied Neil's performances, the more she discovered that every subdivision carried a purpose. Notes that seemed insignificant suddenly became critical. Tiny accents shaped entire phrases. Small details transformed the emotional impact of the song. And once she finally mastered that first layer of subdivisions, another obstacle appeared. Because hidden inside the groove was a second subdivision that was even more deceptive. Unlike the flowing 16th note pulse, this one had the power to completely throw a drummer off balance. Miss it by just a fraction of a second, and the entire character of the song changes. By the time Anika nilles had worked through the song's underlying 16th note pulse, she had already learned an important lesson. Nothing in Neil Peart's playing was accidental. Every accent served a purpose. Every transition told part of the story. And that leads us to the second subdivision she effectively had to relearn: the syncopated offbeat accents. This is one of the defining characteristics of Neil Peart's drumming, especially during Rush's early 1980s period. In subdivisions, many of the most important rhythmic moments don't land where listeners naturally expect them to. Instead of emphasizing the strongest beats, Neil often shifted attention to the spaces between them. That's called syncopation. And while the concept sounds simple, executing it consistently is incredibly difficult. Think about it this way. Most rock drummers create stability by reinforcing the main pulse. Neil often created excitement by dancing around it. The groove remains solid, but accents appear in unexpected locations. The listener feels movement and energy without always understanding why. This approach fit perfectly with the song's theme. Subdivisions is about people who feel disconnected from the crowd, people who don't quite move with everyone else. In a strange way, Neil's drumming mirrors that emotional message. The rhythm itself refuses to behave in predictable ways. For Anika nilles, reproducing those offbeat accents wasn't simply a matter of counting correctly. She had to internalize where Neil wanted the listener's attention to go. That's much harder than reading notes from a chart. A drummer can technically play every stroke correctly and still miss the musical intention behind it. Neil's performances were filled with these subtle choices. He understood how a single accent could change the emotional direction of a phrase. He knew when to create tension. He knew when to release it. And nowhere is that more obvious than during the transitions throughout subdivisions. The fills don't crash into the next section. They guide the listener there. That's why so many Rush fans instantly recognize when something feels different. They're not just hearing notes. They're hearing decades of carefully crafted musical decisions. As Anika continued preparing the song, she reportedly found herself studying details that many drummers might normally overlook. What seemed small on paper often became crucial in performance. But even after mastering the 16th note framework and the offbeat accents, one final challenge remained. And this third subdivision may have been the most difficult of all. Because it wasn't just about rhythm, it was about perspective. It was the hidden layer that connected Neil Peart's technical brilliance to his storytelling ability. The layer that transformed subdivisions from a great drum performance into a musical masterpiece. And once Anika discovered it, she began to understand why Neil Peart remains one of the most respected drummers in rock history. It wasn't buried inside a difficult time signature. And it wasn't something that could be solved simply by practicing faster. In many ways, it was the most challenging element of all, because it required Anika nilles to think like a composer, not just a drummer. Neil Peart had a remarkable ability to divide phrases into smaller, rhythmic conversations. Instead of treating the drum kit as a timekeeping instrument, he used it as a storytelling tool. That's the third subdivision, phrase subdivision. Rather than focusing only on individual beats, Neil often organized larger musical ideas into smaller groups that flowed across bar lines. A fill might begin in one measure and seem to resolve in another. An accent pattern might connect two sections of a song that appear unrelated on paper. The result is a sense of forward motion that keeps listeners engaged without them even realizing why. This is one of the reasons Rush's music continues to reward repeated listening. The more closely you listen, the more connections you discover. For Anika, understanding these larger rhythmic phrases was essential. If she approached each measure as a separate event, the song could sound correct but feel disconnected. Neil never played that way. He was always thinking ahead, always leading the listener somewhere. Many musicians who worked with or studied Neil have commented on his attention to structure. His drum parts were carefully designed to support the architecture of a song rather than simply showcase technical ability. That philosophy is especially clear in subdivisions. The song gradually builds emotional intensity. The arrangement expands, the energy rises, and Neil's drum parts help guide that journey from beginning to end. This meant Anika couldn't just memorize sections individually. She had to understand how every section connected to the next. Why one fill happened there. Why a certain accent appeared there. Why the dynamics changed at a specific moment. Once those answers became clear, the song itself began to make more sense. Suddenly, isolated drum parts transformed into a complete musical narrative. But this realization also revealed something surprising. The challenge wasn't really about playing Neil Peart's notes. The challenge was learning how Neil Peart thought. And according to Anika's own comments about preparing Rush material, that mental shift may have been the most demanding part of the entire process. As rehearsals continued, Anika Nilles found herself facing a reality that every drummer who has attempted Rush music eventually discovers. Neil Peart's greatest challenge isn't his speed, it isn't his endurance, and it isn't even his technical complexity. It's the responsibility that comes with performing music that means so much to so many people. Rush fans are famously loyal. For decades, they watched Neil Peart build one of the most respected legacies in rock history. His precision, creativity, and dedication to his craft set a standard that few drummers have ever reached. That meant anyone stepping into a Rush-related performance would inevitably face enormous expectations. And Anika knew it. The goal wasn't to replace Neil. Nobody can. Instead, the goal was to honor the music while remaining authentic to herself as a musician. That's a delicate balance. Lean too heavily toward imitation, and the performance can feel forced. Stray too far from the original, and longtime fans may feel something important has been lost. The solution came from the very lessons she learned while studying subdivisions. By understanding the three key layers of Neil's drumming, the 16th note foundation, the syncopated offbeat accents, and the larger phrase subdivisions, she wasn't simply copying drum parts anymore. She was understanding the musical logic behind them. That distinction matters. When musicians truly understand why something works, they can perform it with confidence rather than fear. And confidence is exactly what Rush's music demands. Fans don't just hear technical accuracy. They hear conviction. They hear commitment. They hear whether a performer genuinely understands the spirit of the music. According to interviews discussing her preparation process, Anika repeatedly emphasized how much respect she gained for Neil's approach while learning the material. The deeper she went into the songs, the more she appreciated the incredible level of detail hidden within them. What initially appeared to be a drumming challenge became a masterclass in musical thinking, and nowhere was that lesson more powerful than in Subdivisions. Because beneath the famous lyrics and unforgettable synthesizer lines lies a drum performance that continues to teach new lessons more than 40 years after it was recorded. But perhaps the most remarkable part of the story isn't what Anika learned. In the end, the story of Anika Nilles learning Subdivisions isn't really about one song. It's about what happens when a world-class musician encounters the work of another world-class musician and discovers just how deep that work truly goes. From the outside, many people see Neil Peart's legacy through the lens of technical achievement. They see the massive drum kits. They see the complex fills. They see the odd time signatures and marathon performances. All of those things are impressive. But as Anika's experience demonstrates, the true brilliance of Neil Peart went far beyond technique. His real gift was musical design. Every subdivision had a purpose. Every accent contributed to the story. Every fill connected one emotional moment to the next. Nothing was wasted. That's why songs like Subdivisions continue to resonate decades after their release. Listeners may not consciously hear every rhythmic detail, but they feel the effect of those details. They feel the tension, they feel the movement. They feel the emotional arc that Neil carefully built into the music. For Anika Nilles, mastering those ideas required more than practice. It required a complete shift in perspective. She had to move beyond learning drum parts and begin learning the thought process behind them. The 16th note framework taught her how Neil controlled the pulse. The syncopated accents revealed how he created excitement and tension. The larger phrase, subdivisions, showed how he transformed drumming into storytelling. Together, those three layers formed a blueprint for understanding one of rock music's most influential drummers. And perhaps that's the greatest tribute any musician can offer. Not imitation, not replication, but understanding. Because when great music survives generation after generation, it's usually because someone takes the time to uncover the ideas hidden beneath the surface. That's exactly what Anika Nilles did. And in the process, she reminded fans why Neil Peart's work remains so extraordinary. More than 40 years after Subdivisions was recorded, drummers are still studying it, still learning from it, still discovering new details inside it. And if a drummer of Anika Nilles' caliber had to completely rethink parts of her own approach to understand those subdivisions, that tells us everything we need to know about the genius of Neil Peart. His music wasn't just played, it was engineered. it was composed. And most importantly, it was built to last. That's why the lessons hidden inside subdivisions continue to challenge, inspire, and fascinate musicians around the world, and why Neil Peart's influence remains as powerful as today.